So this is one of those questions जिसके अंदर they've asked us to make a distinction between um an income tax which is more fairer than a sales tax. So basically direct और indirect tax के बीच में ये question का comparison आया था. Um, Kids did attempt this one, लेकिन इसका जो part B था that was a bit more on the complicated side for many of the kids. लेकिन वो भी it's one of those questions जो हमारे variant के अंदर आ चुका है. ये November 23 के अंदर let me show you the other question also जो part B इसका आ चुका है. This was assess whether a government should always aim to balance its budget rather than have a budget surplus or a budget deficit. एग्जैक्टली इसी तरह का क्वेश्चन हमारे वेरिएंट के अंदर नेक्स्ट नवंबर के अंदर आया था फिर सो विल सॉल्व वन ऑफ द टूल्स बिकॉज है तो वो इम्पोर्टेंट बिकॉज केस स्टडी के अंदर तो अभी भी आने के चांसेस तो हैं उसके सो लेट्स बिगिन विद दिस so far, I think we should have a very good idea as to how the question needs to be answered and what is the knowledge and understanding, what is the analysis, and what should the evaluation be like. So in this one, they're saying explain the reasons why government imposed taxes, right? So knowledge and understanding in there, we should have at least three reasons because remember, 3 marks for knowledge and understanding. तो कोई भी three reasons you can come up with. I know there are several reasons, but one of the things that I would definitely mention here when you're writing it, usually one of the major reasons that students do write is that government wants to raise revenue. I particularly must have mentioned this before also, but I think it's incomplete if you just say कि government taxes लगाती है so that they have money, uh, they have, uh, they raise some money, the government may have a surplus or something like that. But we must mention as to why the government wants to raise this money, right? So maybe we want to say that they want to raise money to finance uh, their public services, right? And you would want to give like examples of it that maybe they want to fund education, they want to deal with healthcare services, that's where they want to spend. Or maybe like defense and infrastructure, that's also perfectly. Examples ko aap limit na karo, write as many as you can think of. Because remember, without government revenue, it would be impossible, right, for the government to provide these services. तो ये टैक्सेशन से आ सकता है एंड नॉर्मली जब हम बजट की बात करते हैं गवर्नमेंट का बजट विच विल डील विद इन द सेकंड पार्ट मोस्टली जब आप बुक्स के अंदर व्हेन यू गोइंग टू रीड दे गोइंग टू से गवर्नमेंट स्पेंडिंग वर्सेस टैक्स रेवेन्यू वैसे तो इट शुड बी मच मोर ओवरऑल लाइक गवर्नमेंट रेवेन्यू हमें कहना चाहिए but usually in many places you're going to see that they're going to just say tax revenue. One of the reasons why they're probably doing that is because government का जो tax revenue होता है that is an overwhelming percentage of the government's revenue. बाकियों के अंदर क्या हो सकता है बाकियों के अंदर फाइन्स हो सकते हैं कुछ इंटरेस्ट अर्निंग्स हो सकती हैं पेनल्टीज हो सकती हैं पब्लिक कॉर्पोरेशंस के प्रॉफिट्स हो सकते हैं बट दीज आर वेरी नेग्लिजिबल mostly the money that the government is getting is coming from taxes. And just for understanding purposes, उसमें से भी जो majority chunk आ रहा होता है वो direct taxes से आता है. Usually indirect taxes के अंदर, because ये question थोड़ा सा overall है, is about imposing taxes. So they're not right now breaking के reasons में बताओ कि direct taxes के reason या indirect taxes के reason. Usually in our discussion, we will say that if the government wants to raise money, it's probably coming from direct taxes because majority countries direct taxes को use करती हैं to fund. इनडायरेक्ट टैक्सेस का जो पर्पस होता है वो ज्यादातर डिस्करेजिंग के लिए होता है. It's not your primary focus for indirect taxes, जो goods and services पे लगाते हो, is not to raise money, but to uh, move people away from that good, discourage. Direct taxes is where. अगर मैं इसको percentages के वाइज बात करें, तो यूजुअली डेवलप्ड कंट्रीज के अंदर 75-80% of the tax revenue is coming from direct. 20 to 25% is coming from indirect. Okay, their focus is indirect is to discourage, take people away from demerit goods or imported goods, right? लेकिन पाकिस्तान जैसे मुल्क के अंदर where you don't have a very large tax base and the government spending is plenty, तो वहां पर हमारी जैसी इकोनॉमी के अंदर they do rely almost पाकिस्तान के अंदर you can say 50-50 is coming from direct and indirect. Okay, but that's just because of the desperation. Purpose different होते हैं. And I think in books you're going to read what I've just explained उसी consistency के साथ. Okay, so that's our first reason. Our second reason, मैं थोड़ा सा एक direct और एक indirect के point of view से कर लेता हूँ. Our second reason is redistribution of income, which means that let's redistribution of income and reduce income inequality. Please, जब भी आप inequality को mention करते हैं, please be clear that you're talking about income and wealth inequality, because obviously taxation का discussion gender inequality को तो नहीं deal कर सकता. So when you keep it open-ended like inequality, then any kind of inequality can be discussed, right? Examiner is not going to assume that you're talking about income inequality. So always do mention कि आप income inequality की बात कर रहे हैं. At least even if you don't mention it, but in your explanation, that idea should be clear. So आप क्या करते हैं? One of the ways is that high income groups को आप high income groups are taxed high percentage and low income groups are taxed on low percentage. So इससे आपकी equality का, again, I don't want to go into too much details because एक mark के लिए we're solving this, right? Number three, एक indirect taxes का मैं ले लेता हूँ, which is one of our favorite ones, that we say कि you want to discourage uh, consumption of demerit or harmful goods, you know. So, like, for example, I can give an example. We do like examples. Honestly, sometimes your examples just, um, is that extra explanation that we require to make sure that, you know what, the answer is not too vague. So, tobacco or alcohol, like tax on tobacco and alcohol can raise their prices and reduce consumption. ठीक है? So something along this line. So good three reasons. I'm sure that they will accept other reasons also. In my opinion, these are like the top three that you should write about. आप obviously import duties की भी बात कर सकते हैं, जिससे import की reduction हो सकती है to improve your current account, right? फिर उसके बाद let's go back to the question and consider
Tariffs
whether.
are included in this.
Sure, because tariffs are also indirect taxes. They're part of indirect taxes. So sure, you can do that. Import duties होती हैं. So Absolutely correct. You can do that. But make sure that you then explain the whole idea okay, why are you trying to do that? What are you trying to achieve? And it's mostly that you want to discourage imported goods, maybe encourage local goods, or improve the current account balance. जिससे imports कम हो जाएंगे, exports ज़्यादा हो जाएंगे. That's fine. It's part of indirect taxes. Okay. And consider whether an increase in income tax is fairer than an increase in sales tax. Clearly, यहाँ पे they want to test your understanding. Okay, you know the distinction between the two. So before like going into analysis, I think examiners, I might have to see in the marking scheme, but I'm sure the examiner must be interested in seeing whether the kids have been able to distinguish कि इनकम टैक्सेस जो हैं वो डायरेक्ट हैं और सेल्स टैक्सेस जो हैं वो इनडायरेक्ट हैं. I would be interested. Otherwise, why would I do it like this? Otherwise, I would have just simply mentioned direct versus indirect taxes. Uh, you know. So for my analysis, कि इनकम टैक्सेस जो हैं वो ज्यादा फेयर हैं एज कंपेयर टू सेल्स टैक्स. सो आई विल मेंशन वन ऑफ द थिंग्स इज कि जो इनकम टैक्स होता है, income tax is actually a direct tax. If you want to explain, let me just give you an explanation of what direct taxes is. So we can say that it is paid, I think you should always do that, directly on incomes earned, okay? Uh, Whereas sales tax are indirect taxes, and they are imposed on goods and services, right? So that sort of like um, explains it. Imposed on goods and services when a consumer purchases it. So consumer has to pay that, and then the producer indirectly submits that to the government. Obviously, I don't want to get into the whole burden and all right now with this because that's not what the question's focus is. The question's focus is which one is fairer and which one's not. So, so we want to suggest that if you increase income tax, it may be considered more fairer because of मेरे ख्याल में आप डायरेक्ट टैक्सेस की बात करें और फेयरनेस का डिस्कशन ना हो and you explain that income tax आप ज्यादा लगाते हैं on a person with higher incomes and lower लगाते हैं, I think you have to mention uh, the progressive taxation, that this is called progressive taxation. You must do that, in my opinion. So, progressive taxation क्या होती है? That higher income earners, when your incomes rise, the average tax rate that you pay goes up, and when your income falls, so your average tax rate that you pay goes down. So obviously that sort of like talks in terms of the ability of people to pay. People who have lower incomes, उनके लिए, every thousand matters. So you should tax them lower, and you can give them example. ये पाकिस्तान का मैं केस आपको समझा देता हूँ. पाकिस्तान के अंदर क्या होता है कि इनकम टैक्स सिस्टम ऑलमोस्ट ऑल कंट्रीज इन द वर्ल्ड यूजेस प्रोग्रेसिव टैक्स सिस्टम, majority. So in Pakistan, if you make like 50,000 rupees per month, okay, so as per government, you pay 0% taxes. ठीक है, गवर्नमेंट ने it has made it tax free. Okay. फिर उसके बाद, because obviously the government realizes that if a person is making 50,000, for him, every 1,000, 2,000 matters. Because if we charge like a couple of thousands as taxes from this individual, so he has to compromise on essentials like maybe बच्चों की school की quality might change, maybe healthcare facility की expenditure might change, maybe protein in terms of the food that they're eating, उसके अंदर they might have to compromise. So a household making 50,000, every 500 or 1,000 rupee is very important. But then उसके बाद क्या होता है that if you end up making, like in पाकिस्तान का केस मैं समझा देता हूँ, if you end up making 60,000 rupees per month, ठीक है, so the what government does is the government does not tax you on the 50,000. That 50,000 is taxed on 0%. That means you have that entire sum of money to spend, and on that other 10,000, they're going to tax you very little, like 2.5% they're going to charge you. So 2.5% तो कुछ भी नहीं होता. Maybe like 1,000 or 10,000 के अंदर क्या होगा? Maybe um, what it would be? A couple of hundred rupees, maybe like 2,000 rupees, not 2,000, 200 rupees or something. So very little government is taxing you. But clearly, agar, if you go on a higher income, again, Pakistan ka case mein bata raha hu, if you make something like 5 lakh rupees a month, so then it's a whole different thing. 5 lakh rupees ke andar. So 5 lakh rupees a month, if you are earning, government, मैं एक average तुमको बता देता हूँ, but government takes about 150,000 rupees from you. So you have 350,000 rupees that you can spend because obviously the government feels you can take care of a lot of your needs and education and healthcare. It's only the luxuries that you will compromise on if you're making uh, 500 a month. तो ये ऑलमोस्ट टैक्स ब्रैकेट जो चला जाता है, द मार्जिनल टैक्स ब्रैकेट जो है, that is somewhere Pakistan mein it's somewhere near 39%. The highest bracket is 39%, which applies on any income that you earn above 5 lakh rupees a month. So government takes almost near 40% of that. And then whenever you buy any good and services like petrol and all, उसके ऊपर आपने additional tax भी pay करना होता है. तो ये हमारा एक कॉन्सेप्ट है ऑफ इनकम टैक्स, एंड आई थिंक दैट्स अ रीजनेबल एक्सप्लेनेशन. मेक श्योर एक अच्छी सी इसकी एक एग्जांपल दिया करो टू प्रूव दैट इट इज ऑन द मोर फेयर साइड. लेकिन ऑन द अदर हैंड, जहां तक सेल्स टैक्स की बात है, इट इज अ मस्ट डिस्कशन दैट यू ऑलवेज हैव टू डू. सेल्स टैक्स जो है वो रिग्रेसिव टैक्स होता है इन नेचर. इट्स अ रिग्रेसिव टैक्स. What does that mean, regressive tax? That when your income goes up, the average tax rate that you pay is goes down, and when your incomes go down, the average tax rate goes up. So it burdens low income earners more. इसको हम इस तरह से एग्जांपल ले लेते हैं कि पाकिस्तान का केस अभी ऑब्वियसली वी ऑल ऑफ अस नो दैट द पेट्रोल प्राइसेस जस्ट वेंट अप 325 रुपीस पर लीटर. उससे पहले जब ये 200 एंड समथिंग था, 250 60, लास्ट वाज व्हाट 200 एंड आई थिंक 60 और 75 और समथिंग. तो उस वक्त जब गवर्नमेंट का, फॉर एवरी लीटर द गवर्नमेंट टेक्स अबाउट क्लोज टू नियर, थोड़ा सा राउंड अप कर रहा हूं, बट क्लोज टू 90 रुपीज पर लीटर द गवर्नमेंट इज टेकिंग. ये उस वक्त की मैं बात कर रहा हूँ व्हेन द प्राइस वाज 270, लेट्स से. तो आउट ऑफ विच द गवर्नमेंट वाज टेकिंग इन टर्म्स ऑफ टैक्सेस नियर 90 रुपीज. ठीक है. सो अ पर्सन जो अपनी मोटरसाइकिल के अंदर 1 लीटर डलाता है, दैट पर्सन पर लीटर इज ऑल्सो पेइंग 90 रुपीज इन टैक्सेस. Whereas a person जो अपनी लैंड क्रूजर के अंदर पर लीटर जो 90 रुपीज पे कर रहा है, we're not talking about the amount of liters and the total amount of tax. What we're saying is per liter, both individuals are paying 90 rupees, right? When you compare that to their respective incomes, so clearly we can see that 90% of your 50,000 की income and 90 rupees of your 5 lakh rupees की income, average tax rate के point of view से, it's the poor which is getting burdened more. Obviously, मैंने अपने example के अंदर भी जो है, I've taken a very like a necessity based product, um, and that is the discussion that I'm going to do अपनी evaluation के अंदर, where I will have to sort of like make my final discussion. Going back to the question is, um, consider whether an increase in income tax is fairer than an increase in sales tax. तो मुझे अपनी final conclusions तो देनी है इसके अंदर. So the thing is, if you ask me, I pay a lot of taxes. I pay more taxes than many politicians do. Maybe many people who run reasonable businesses who have ways to hide that. I might feel that maybe it discourages me. Too much taxation discourages me. So when we come to the discussion of fairness, I feel that progressive taxation is not fair. It's unfair. Charging 39% on the higher incomes, I have to work really hard. Individuals might say that to earn every extra dollar, we have to put in more time and effort, and a lot of effort goes. And now you're taxing me more on something that takes more effort from me. So it sort of like discourages me from doing that work. So if I'm earning one extra lakh rupees and the government takes 40% of that and I have to work extra hours for it, so that actually discourages me from working. It might hurt my productivity. It might hurt my interest in investments. That if I do investments and I earn higher incomes, then the government is taking a higher chunk of that. So maybe it's not a feasible idea. So that is what I will discuss in my evaluation, in my last discussion, something along this line. The fairness of tax increase depends on circumstances. Okay? What kind of circumstances? Well, problem is that if an increase in taxation discourages work efforts or hurts productivity or even investment, amongst high income earners, so it may not be fairer. ये एक डिस्कशन जो है ना, ये बार बार आता है. When the elite are taxed, they say that we're the ones who are running the big businesses, we're the one who's taking the risks, and if there's a loss, it's our loss. So we should be allowed to make high profits. We create nokri for a lot of people in the economy. So you should actually not be discouraging us. You should be actually promoting. So it's a very like slippery slope of a discussion that happens इस situation के अंदर. अच्छा, also I can make an argument where I can say sales tax fair हो सकते हैं, because अगर हम sales tax को lower कर दें on essential and raise कर दें on luxuries, right? Food items, economy transportation, public transportation, lower your taxes on that. Maybe on the fuel, certain quantities of fuel के ऊपर आपने कम टैक्स ले लिया, सीएनजी पे कम टैक्स ले लिया, एलपीजी पे डिफरेंट टैक्स ले लिया, एंड प्रीमियम पेट्रोल के ऊपर आपने टैक्सेस बढ़ा दिए, लग्जरीज के ऊपर, बिजनेस क्लास फ्लाइट्स के ऊपर, बिजनेस ट्रैवल्स के ऊपर, सो यू कैन इंक्रीज. तो फिर उस पॉइंट ऑफ व्यू से यू कैन मेक दैट डिस्कशन. तो for my final conclusion, it really depends on the type of goods that you're imposing these taxes on, the percentage of taxation, direct taxation, progressive taxation, how high can it go? I think Scandinavian countries के अंदर it can go highest up to uh, it can go highest up to 50% and lowest जो है वो 0% तक है, राइट? सो 0% तक. और पाकिस्तान के अंदर भी हैव 0% एंड द हाईएस्ट इज आई थिंक 39%. तो उस रेंज के अंदर होता है हमारा भी. आई डोंट थिंक इट शुड गो अबव लाइक 25-30% because we know that then tax evasion का problem comes in also. So we can talk about that also in our evaluation, that if you tax too high, then people will actually steal those taxes. So that's a problem. All right, moving on. The same year, we have a 12 marker which came. A good question, I think. Um, Tests a lot of things over here about the kids' knowledge about the budget. You will be surprised कि government budget के अंदर how many essays. I can actually give you statistics when we were checking questions like this. Um, Almost in every 15 attempts, there were about two kids who would treat budget surplus and deficit as trade surplus and trade deficits. We want to avoid that, right? We want to make sure that हम ये ना काम करें. Trade deficit is exports and imports. Budget deficit is government spending and taxation. So, assess whether government should always aim to balance its budget rather than have a budget surplus or a budget deficit. Obviously, you have to explain a lot of terminology over here. So, first things, question ka, this is how I would check this one. If you tell me what budget surplus, what balanced budget means, what budget surplus is, what budget deficit is, I'll give you like level 2, 3 marks for telling me what they are. In order to get balanced budget and balanced budget ke advantages. Okay. So that should be your up to level 2, 4 marks. And then surplus or deficit ka discussion is mandatory to take you on a level 3. ठीक है, so that's how I will check. सबसे पहले, make sure I'll just give you pointers on this. First, you have to talk about what is balanced budget, where you will explain me that the government spending is equals to the government's tax revenue in a fiscal year. Government neither have to borrow, because they have enough money in hand to spend. So if they're not borrowing, then their national debt remains stable. It does not increase, it does not reduce. You don't have to borrow, you don't have to not pay higher interest rate. or payments. They are two different things. When you borrow and borrow and borrow, then you have to borrow at higher interest rate because you become one of those uncertain individuals or a country. So, it doesn't show a very good, क्या कहेंगे इसको हम, financial prudence on your side. Um, so that raises a lot of questions. ठीक है. तो यहाँ पर हम ये बात कर सकते हैं फ्रॉम द एडवांटेज पॉइंट ऑफ व्यू. एक एडवांटेज हो गया कि गवर्नमेंट डज नॉट नीड टू बोरो मनी, एंड व्हेन यू डोंट नीड टू बोरो मनी योर डेट डज नॉट चेंज, एटलीस्ट इफ यू हैव एनी. When you don't need to borrow, you don't need to pay higher interest. Okay? When you borrow, then you have to pay higher payments also. So it sort of like saves you from all that. Other than that, if I have to give more advantages, um, it increases foreign investors' confidence in your economy, okay? And it can encourage hot money inflow. Hot money inflow means bahar se capital flight. People can invest in your country because they realize that you're a smart country, knows how to spend the money. You don't go overboard with your spending. You don't have structural issues here. By the way, budget ke andar, there are two budget ke discussions that I've done in the fiscal policy ke lecture, the structural and the cyclical deficits. Cyclical deficits is not something we worry about. It is the structural deficits we worry about, where the government is a heavy spender and does not collect enough and they borrow continuously. That's a problem, right? But agar aapka cyclical hai, that's not a problem because in a down period, obviously government spending is higher, but once the economy goes back up, economic boom cycle के अंदर, then they make a surplus. So that's nothing to worry about. Do look at that. क्योंकि अभी तक वो क्वेश्चन आया नहीं है किसी भी वेरिएंट के अंदर. तो a 3 marker, definitely in an 8 marker regarding के structural और cyclical के बीच में फर्क बताएं क्या होता है. I don't remember कि अभी तक मैंने वो क्वेश्चन देखा है. I have shortlisted all the questions, but I haven't seen that. तो वो बिल्कुल आ सकता है. Okay. So from the advantage point of view, okay, so ये एक हो जाता है. फिर उसके बाद, obviously we want to make a further discussion क्योंकि हर दफा तो गवर्नमेंट बैलेंस बजट नहीं कर सकती ना. Sometimes the government needs to go into a deficit because उनके macroeconomic aims different हो सकते हैं, right? So we can say that sometimes the government can uh, deliberately run budget deficit. अच्छा ये होता क्या है? Where the government spending is greater than taxation. And obviously, this is also called an expansionary. I think that is the must thing that we should always do. This is an expansionary fiscal policy. And we know about expansionary fiscal policy that the government is aiming to increase aggregate demand. And the purpose is that the government is looking for economic growth and incomes to rise and employment to go up as well. So that's what the government's aim usually is. And sometimes it is important for the government to do something like this, right? So, of course, it's a possibility. Um, Sometimes we just want to do that. जैसे पाकिस्तान का case again, let me explain you that after massive stabilization for almost like 2 years, from what 2023 to 2025, we've been trying to stabilize the Pakistani economy, and so we kept the interest rate on the higher side, we kept our inflation rate on the lower side, we kept our taxes on the higher side. So we had been stabilizing, but for growth, you need to go for an expansionary policy. And so sometimes the government wants to do that, and budget deficit is the way for you to achieve something like this. ठीक है? But on the other hand, sometimes the government has to, again, deliberately, the government has to go for a budget surplus where the government spending is supposed to be lesser than the tax. And this is called a contractionary fiscal policy. Um, and the purpose is that the government wants to reduce aggregate demand. And maybe the reason is that the price levels are too high and we want to lower the price levels. Or maybe your current account is in a deficit and you want to lower the deficit. You want to, in order to lower the deficit, Balki, if I write it here, let me say, you already have high prices and you have um, a deficit in the current account and you want to improve your current account, so you might want to go for this policy. तो ये दो मेन हमारे reasons होते हैं which we want to deal with. Sometimes also, जैसे पाकिस्तान के केस में right now, we want to target a budget surplus. It's almost impossible for us. Our ख्वाहिश is that we want to do that. IMF tells us to do that. So that we can do some debt repayments also. Because if you have a surplus, then you will be able to pay back the loans that you have. तो ये भी एक पर्पस हो सकता है. ठीक है. So this is the discussion which is required. First, you talk about balanced budget and its benefits. Then you talk about why would a government be interested in running a budget deficit? Then why would the government be interested in running a budget surplus? And then finally, for evaluation, let's go back to the question. Let me read the question one more time. Why would the government aim to balance its budget rather than having a surplus or a deficit? So my is that they should not always aim for that. Okay, it depends. Okay, my evaluation is that it depends on the fiscal position and the economic conditions, right? If you have stability, low inflation, low economic growth, low unemployment. So if we have a condition like stable prices, high unemployment, low economic growth, then you want to go for a deficit. It's a good time to go for a deficit. AD increases, these things improve, you sort the problems out. Okay? Uh, but if you have like high debt, okay, you have high current account deficits, you have high inflation, then surplus is the aim that you want to follow, right? Um, so it should not always be the aim of the government to follow that. Okay, balanced budget is a khwahish. Mostly the governments are either the economic cycles in a boom or a deficit, boom or a deficit. तो government को जो है वो usually they want to try and tackle those problems, macroeconomic problems. तो balanced budget तो बहुत ही rare होता है. They would love to do it, but it's highly a very small period of time when you can actually achieve it. Majority, you never achieve that. ठीक? So that could be one of the questions that you can attempt in this particular. ठीक? A similar question like this, let me just walk you through a couple of more questions along this line. And अगर उसमें कोई छोटी minor adjustments हैं तो I'll just talk about it. But एक question आया है जून 25 के अंदर हमारा ही वेरिएंट था. Let me open it. Yeah, June 25, variant 21. Yeah. Just take a look at this one. I'll just walk you through the marking schema because it's similar to what we've already done. It's an 8 marker, similar question. Explain the difference between budget surplus and a budget deficit and consider the extent to which budget surplus is better than a budget deficit, to what extent. Along the same lines, but slightly variation in the question. Again, for 3 mark, we have to explain budget surplus and budget deficit. तो क्लियरली 1 मार्क बजट डेफिसिट का हो जाता है, एक बजट सरप्लस का हो जाता है. द थर्ड मार्क I think you should explain is what is a government's budget. A little brief on that. Yep, that's what they are saying. So एक government का budget क्या होता है, which has government spending. Examples दे दो. Government spending on infrastructure and defense and public goods and merit goods and stuff. And the other thing is the tax revenue, where the government is raising funds through direct and indirect taxes, somewhere along this line. I think budget surplus की definition में all we want is that government spending is less than the tax revenue, and budget deficit is government spending is more than the tax revenue, so you need to raise money. फिर उसके बाद the extent to which budget surplus is better. So you want to talk about the benefits and the limitations, maximum 2 marks. So one budget surplus, the good thing and the problem. इसमें क्या हो सकता है? Budget surplus के अंदर the good thing is the government will have surplus money which they can use to pay debt payments, or if they have a budget surplus, that means कि government spending कम है, तो if the economy was going through inflation, the inflation because AD will fall down, तो उसकी वजह से जो है inflation जो है वो cut down हो सकती है. You can just simply connect, right? कि budget surplus, because we'll accept that. Budget surplus means that the government spending is less and taxes is more, so AD falls. When AD falls, your ADAS के diagram के अंदर, the positive thing is that inflation comes under control. The negative thing is unemployment and economic growth goes worse. We'll accept that. Okay. They're saying something over here. There will be a maximum mark of 2 if a candidate only considers a budget surplus or a budget deficit, and they will not, in this case, be able to gain any valuation mark. So budget surplus और deficit दोनों लिखना लाजिम है. Maximum 3 marks मिलेंगे. इसमें से एक limitation या कुछ भूल भी जाओ तो no problems. Too much on budget surplus cannot get you more than 2 marks. Something has to be dealt with budget deficit के. This question is not about a current account of the balance of payment. I guess the reason why they're talking about this is, and fast thought with the note has been made, is because if the student uh, takes it in terms of exports and imports, because remember, exports and import की changes की वजह से भी AD gets affected, and this can happen, and then you can talk about the effects, the for and the against. But if your starting premise is wrong, कि भाई, you're talking about exports is less than exports is greater than imports, so uh, exports is less and imports is more, so AD will fall and then these benefits will come. So फिर you can't get the advantages, you can't get the marks because तुमने starting ही गलत ली हुई है, right? So I guess that's why they've mentioned this. जहां तक बजट डेफिसिट की बात है, बजट डेफिसिट के अंदर you can pick on the for and against arguments that we've made in the previous question, or you can do like government spending is greater than taxation. तो उसकी वजह से जो है AD is going to rise, and when AD increases, the four arguments is economic growth increases and employment rises, but at the same time the inflation might go up, which can hurt people's purchasing power and things like that. So it's very open-ended. I don't know what they might have discussed in the examiners meeting, but I'm sure that all of these and the ones that we've discussed in the previous, as long as it sounds, whatever you're writing is a direct link to के surplus का ये फायदा है, deficit का ये फायदा है. Okay? So the comparison it should not be just like, because sometimes this is what kids will do. They will say कि अच्छा अगर government spending increases so people will get unemployment benefit and infrastructure will improve, and so as a result, you know the living standard and the incomes can rise. But that's only because we're saying कि government spending will rise. Government spending का सिर्फ बढ़ना has not much to do with budget surplus or deficit. In order for us to talk about budget surplus or deficit, your comparison should be that if the government is spending more than the taxation, what that means is that there is more money coming into the system. The inflow is greater than the outflow. Because remember, एक तरफ अगर government spending rise कर रही है, but दूसरी तरफ tax भी बढ़ रहा है, तो हो सकता है you might have a balanced budget and government spending might increase your infrastructure and jobs and all. But that does not necessarily mean that the economy is benefiting. So you want to make a comparison कि surplus का मतलब ये है कि government is spending more and collecting less taxes. So that means economy के अंदर there is more money coming into the system, and that will create AD to go up or down, whichever way surplus key or deficit key, you're making a discussion. So that's how your connection should be made. And then finally, the question is surplus is better than a deficit. Again, ये वही evaluation को हम लेके चल सकते हैं. यहाँ पे they are not saying much about it. It's a depend situation. If an economy is going through a slow economic cycle, deflationary periods, economic growth is falling, unemployment is high, then a surplus is definitely a bad idea. It's going to worsen the recession. Um, but if the economy is going through a deficit, if the economy is going through high inflation period, uncontrollable, you are at full employment, economic growth is at full employment, तो फिर वहां पर maybe a surplus might be a good strategy, because the government may have to repay uh, the debts, and even if inflation comes down, it might not be much of a problem. ठीक है. इसका part B जो है, that has to do with one of the questions जो मैं पीछे करा चुका हूं. Let me just show you this question also. It will relate to one of the questions which I have done in the past. It's just in some other words, and थोड़ा सा question का एक direction है. So please remember, when we're answering, we have to make sure कि हम उस direction को लेके चलें, because I think the previous question we did it was about क्या fiscal policy is the best policy to control is the best policy to manage high inflation? I think that was the question. Now, this question is much more broader in terms of okay, we're not only targeting inflation, but we're talking about the whole economy. So all the benefits of the economy can be considered: economic growth, unemployment, inflation, balance of payment position, so all four of these macroeconomic objectives. But on the other side, they're saying expansionary fiscal policy always benefits the economy. So we know कि level 2 तक तो आसान है, that you discuss expansionary fiscal policy will benefit the economy in this particular way, but then it does not benefit the economy in these ways. ये तुम्हारा गुड लेवल 2 का डिस्कशन हो जाता है। ठीक है। एक्सपेंशनरी, इसमें हमें ऑल्टरनेट पॉलिसी का डिस्कशन करना चाहिए? मेरे ख्याल में तो नहीं करना चाहिए, because the question is not saying is it the best policy. So I think then in that case, you should write for and against maximum points for level 3. पहले for our explanation purposes, it's always a good idea, क्योंकि ऊपर वाले पार्ट में हम वैसे भी बजट को तो एक्सप्लेन कर ही रहे हैं। जब हम बात करते हैं एक्सपेंशनरी फिस्कल पॉलिसी की, तो we're talking about how government spending is greater than taxes. So any discussion that you do on the opposite side, there's no mark for it, and people do that. There is no marks, zero marks for discussing contractionary fiscal policy. Question is aimed at expansionary fiscal policy. But evaluation के अंदर, let's see if we can bring it in somehow. अब जहां तक, if you're going for expansionary fiscal policy, we want to explain how expansionary fiscal policy can increase aggregate demand. How can it do that? You want to explain that higher government taxation, government spending on whatever things you want to talk about, थोड़ा सा लेंदी तो करना है ना, या lower taxes. Slash लगा हुआ है, that means they will not be treated as two different points. But अगर आप expand करेंगे तो definitely आपको ticks मिलेंगे। दो separate paragraphs के अंदर you should explain how lowering taxes will increase the disposable income, and that will increase consumption and increase investments from the business's point of view. And as a result, AD is going to increase. लेकिन अभी भी मैंने advantages explain नहीं किए, मैं तो सिर्फ theory explain कर रहा हूँ। Similarly, government spending is a direct part in your AD. जब AD बढ़ेगा, तो now my advantages can be discussed. You can do the diagram if you want, but there is no mark for the diagram. बट एडवांटेजेस को आप अच्छे से एक्सप्लेन करें प्लीज, किस तरीके से एडी की बढ़ने की वजह से there may be an increase in the price level, but mainly economic growth will rise and employment is going to rise, right? So that needs to be talked about. इसके अलावा और भी अगर आप advantages explain कर सकें तो please do that, because you're going to get ticks for every advantage that you're going to explain. One of the advantages other than this, simply लोगों का income बढ़ना, standard of living का increase हो जाना is a fair argument. Businesses will be able to invest more, they can make more profits. उसकी वजह से जो है countries का future के अंदर, अगर government spending is on merit goods and supply side वाली जो spending होती है ना, which we discussed last time also, that government spending on education, healthcare, investments on infrastructure, all three of them, short run में तो AD को बढ़ा देते हैं, long run में AS को बढ़ा देंगे, तो expansionary fiscal policy can in the long run increase aggregate supply, which can lower the inflation and increase aggregate supply and economic growth. तो वो advantages में बिल्कुल count हो सकता है, from the basics to a little more expanded discussion. ठीक है। फिर उसके बाद we want to explain the disadvantages, क्योंकि जहां तक ये प्रॉब्लम ये आपकी आ रही है, when you're going for expansionary, you're obviously going through a budget deficit also, क्योंकि government spending is greater than taxation, so you need to borrow money. Financing needs to be done. When you borrow money, there are two things which goes on. One is the interest rate goes up because other people see that you continuously need to borrow, the government becomes more desperate. तो फिर वहां पर जो है आपको फिर higher interest rate पे करना पड़ता है in order to raise money. And when interest rate goes up and you already owe people money, your interest payments also go up. अब इसमें बुरी बात क्या है? Interest payment going up. The buri thing is that the government eventually has to cut down on its spending on development and infrastructure and people, education, healthcare, in order to pay these interest payments. So the government is not able to um, do the required social welfare payments, and that's a burden on them. And साथ ही में another disadvantage is that it is inflationary because when AD shifts to the right, prices go up. ये तुम्हारा पूरा होना चाहिए. One thing that I have commonly seen over here is ये लोग कॉपी पेस्ट कर देते हैं लेवल 1, लेवल 2, लेवल 3 के लिए और यहाँ लिखा होता है विल कंसिडर ऑल्टरनेटिव पॉलिसी स्लैश कॉन्सेप्ट एंड विल बी बैलेंस्ड. I feel that even if this is written, it does not mean that the question requires. ये एक बहुत ही generic level 1, level 2, level 3 का एक copy pasted वो है. ये question to question vary करता है, by the way. I have seen questions where this is written, but they have specifically told us कि alternative जब हमने मांगा ही नहीं है in the question does not need to be discussed. What it means is that maybe we'll consider an alternative concepts and etc. So that can be like whole different other advantages and disadvantages, right? Um, so please, ये इसको देख के confuse नहीं हो जाना. Usually alternative is only done when the question begs that discussion that maybe is fiscal. यहाँ पे उन्होंने simple ये बोला है क्या expansionary is always the best. So that means expansionary is not, and that should be it मेरी नजर के अंदर. I don't think कि यहाँ
The
पे
points they give enough or are just examples?
um try to जो आप advantages and disadvantages दे रहे हैं ना, make sure that you give plenty. Okay. When the question is about best, so we know के alternative लिखने के ऊपर marks मिलेंगे like in the previous question. So when you do monetary and fiscal, so you get more ticks. Just think of it as it's a matter of getting 8 ticks ताकि मुझे 8 out of 8 मिल सके in your analysis and knowledge and understanding. AO1 and AO2. So because the question is not going to factor in the alternative policies, so now you have to compensate your ticks by writing more advantages and disadvantages. I think we've done reasonably good in our discussion where you want to add, like for example, यहाँ पर सिर्फ ये दो लिखे हुए हैं, but in my discussion, I went slightly a little more on the advantages where I did say about after making this discussion, ये अगर आप discussion करते हो ना और ये वाला and how economic growth will rise and employment will rise, you should be able to get up to 4 marks because you have explained the whole process through which this is happening. इधर इन्होंने सिर्फ lower unemployment लिखा है, higher economic growth, higher incomes, greater ability to spend, purchasing power going up, more ability to spend on goods and services, and standard of living rise. And I don't know what else I might have talked about, but पूरी एक ओवरऑल जो मैंने एक एएस की बात की है कि फ्यूचर में एएस बढ़ जाएगा विच विल फर्दर प्रमोट इकोनॉमी एंड ऑल, तो वो एक एडेड डिस्कशन है जो मैं चाह रहा हूं कि यू शुड डू सो दैट यू कैन गेट टिक्स ऑन दैट. More ticks means that there is no place for us. देखो and this happened this year also, and it happened last year also, the examiner, पहले क्या हुआ था 2023 की जब मैं एग्जाम्स चेक कर रहा था ना, तो वहां पर 8 मार्कर्स के अंदर टिक्स वर इम्पोर्टेंट, 12 मार्कर में टिक्स वर नॉट इम्पोर्टेंट. व्हाट डू आई मीन बाय दैट? जब एग्जामिनर्स हमें असिस्ट करते हैं एंड व्हेन दे चेक आवर चेकिंग, तो उनके लिए क्या होता है कि रेड फ्लैग्स क्या होते हैं, दैट आई हैव पुट इन मोर टिक्स and I have given lesser marks, or I have put less ticks and I have given more marks. So definitely the examiner will look into my paper and see कि ये क्या है. Why are the ticks more and marks are less? So they will double check my examination. So 2024 नवंबर के अंदर and 2025 के papers के अंदर, I very discreetly remember they telling us that please make sure 8 mark ho या 12 marker ho, your ticks needs to match your marks. तो इसका मतलब है कि for me to give you more and more ticks, you have to have more and more clearer points for me to do that. तो उसके लिए sometimes an elaboration can get you 2 marks, okay? But sometimes that elaboration may not be enough. तो अब ये किस तरीके से तुम लोग डिस्टिंग्विश कर सकते हो? आई डोंट थिंक इट इज पॉसिबल, बिकॉज मी एज एन एग्जामिनर हैज अ चैलेंज इन डूइंग कि ये इज इट इनफ एक्सप्लेनेशन और नॉट. तुम्हारे इस क्वेश्चन के अंदर बेस मार्क्स देने के लिए every one of these 4 things has to be there. This has to be there, this has to be there, this has to be there, and this has to be there. ये 4 चीजें तो मस्ट हैं, and I'll give you 4 marks. But I'm saying thoda sa expansion karo, try to get a couple of more ticks here by discussing a few more things. Sometimes what might happen is they might say, when AD increases, economic growth and employment increase, ye to ek and this, ye to ek hi point treat ho sake. I'm telling you, in some of the marking schemes, it will be considered as 1 point. So what you want to do is you want to expand on your explanation. किस तरीके से कि if AD is increasing, there is a greater demand for your goods and services. So therefore, firms will hire more workers and they will utilize more of this capacity, and therefore employment will increase. That's a big explanation where I am telling कि कैसे AD की वजह से there will be higher demand for resources, so more resources will be demanded, and so therefore unemployment will fall. Economic growth के लिए what can I do? Well, when AD is increasing and the real output is increasing, real more output is being produced in the economy, which means that um, um, more goods and services are produced in real terms. ठीक, सो जब वो रियल टर्म्स के अंदर ज्यादा होगा, तो ऑब्वियसली उसकी वजह से इकोनॉमिक ग्रोथ विल हैपन, बिकॉज जब जीडीपी राइज करता है एंड यू कैन टेक आउट देयर परसेंटेज चेंजेस एंड यू विल सी the economic growth rate will go up, which means higher incomes. When people have higher incomes, they will be able to spend more, their purchasing power will rise, and so their standard of living will go up. That's a really high, just a in some ways you can say एक बहुत ही flowery explanation है, but it's a fair explanation to make.
And diagrams get more point marks.
There is no mark for diagram.
You use that
No
for
mark for
explanation.
explanation के marks है. There is no mark for diagram. I am just saying that if you use this diagram for that extended explanation that we're doing, that's fine. But diagram के in itself, I won't say कि oh बच्चे ने diagram बनाया है तो I should give him 1 extra mark. I will not do that. Right? There is no objective mark because they haven't asked for a diagram. But for my support, if I'm using the diagram, it's just going to help me write a better explanation, more flowery explanation, more material. ओके, बिकॉज यहाँ पे भी देखो हर जगह जहाँ लिखा है इंक्रीज इन एडी, इंक्रीज इन एडी, they're not saying will shift the AD to the right or something. So that means there is no diagram in the examiner's mind. He's just simply talking about how overall aggregate demand will rise in the economy. So it's all theoretical. You don't do the diagram and you explain me everything that that diagram is doing. I'll give you full marks, no problem. डायग्राम के मार्क्स सिर्फ तब हैं जब आप उसकी एक्सप्लेनेशन देंगे या हमने मांगा है. That's it. And any diagram you make without any explanation, when they don't ask for a diagram, so तब तो it's worth nothing. Your final evaluation, let me just go back to the question. Assess whether expansionary fiscal policy always benefits an economy. I think we've done a reasonable explanation. So now, obviously, we have to recognize circumstances where expansionary fiscal policy can be always beneficial and may not be always beneficial. Again, in my head, I'm thinking about the LRAS curve. And again, I don't have to make this curve, but if I explain in terms of spare capacity and underutilization, and if I say that the economy is below potential, and if I use expansionary fiscal policy, it is always beneficial in that way that an expansionary fiscal policy will increase AD without raising inflation and gives me a lot of benefits. So definitely it's a good one. But considering that economy should not have government should not have a lot of debt on it, because more borrowing can increase that debt levels and the future it can hurt. So एक तरफ से short run long run discussion है और दूसरी तरफ एक discussion है कि economy किस position के ऊपर at the moment है. So definitely if we are at potential, an expansionary fiscal policy is definitely not a good idea. It's going to create all inflation and no increase in economic growth or employment. So that's the limitation. So I think evaluation को आप उस तरह से discuss करें. You can notice किस तरह से ये fiscal AD or LRAS always comes back, and all your advantages and disadvantages are discussed in your X and the Y axes in terms of your macroeconomic objectives. Right? So yeah, so I'll stop here for the day. There are still some questions that I have to discuss on this chapter. And so next class, Kandar, probably we will end this and we'll move on to the international